Have you ever wondered why some people simply pull away and never really go back to being the same? It's not because they became cold, and it's not because they lost the ability to feel. That's a comfortable idea for those watching from the outside, but it hides a much more uncomfortable truth. Almost no one pulls away because they lack emotion. People pull away after trusting the wrong person, and that may seem normal, but it isn't. Pulling away almost always begins in silence, in a very specific moment that few people ever notice. A moment when someone chose to lower their guard, to say too much, to feel too much, to believe too much. It wasn't an impulsive decision or an emotional whim. It was a calculated risk that didn't work out. And when that happens, something shifts inside. It's not the heart that hardens first. It's the mind that learns. That's where the game starts to change. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you learned that being too open comes at a high cost, especially for those living within modern introversion psychology, where feeling deeply is the rule, not the exception. What almost no one realizes is that pulling away isn't a lack of interest in people. It's an attempt to avoid repeating the same pain. And if this feels familiar, stay with me, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, especially about how your mind slowly learned to confuse protection with distance. And maybe that's why so many people listen to this kind of conversation in silence, without commenting, without exposing themselves, just listening and thinking, someone finally put into words what I never managed to explain. If that's happening to you right now, know this: recognizing it isn't weakness. Quite the opposite. When you write in the comments about what you lived through, what you felt, or even just say, "This represents me," you help others realize they're not alone in this pattern of pulling away. Liking this video isn't an empty gesture either. It's a way of keeping this kind of conversation alive, of helping it reach people who still believe that distancing yourself means being cold or incapable of feeling. And if you feel like this space speaks to your experience, subscribing is almost like saying, I want to keep understanding this slowly in my own time, because from here on, the question is no longer why you pulled away. It's what happened inside you after that, and almost no one talks about that part. After that breaking point, something quiet happens inside. When trust turns into risk, the mind changes the rules of the game without asking for permission. The person keeps feeling, sometimes even more than before, but now nothing gets through unchecked. Everything is filtered, weighed, analyzed. Words, gestures, intentions. The introverted mind doesn't shut down emotion. It switches on the radar, and that can look like maturity, like self-control. But almost no one notices the internal cost of living in this constant state of vigilance. At this stage, pulling away stops being emotional and becomes strategic. It's not about not wanting anyone around anymore. It's about reducing variables. Fewer people, fewer risks, less exposure, less impact. Every new interaction turns into a small mental decision. Is it worth it? Is it safe? How far can I go without getting hurt again? This mindset settles in slowly, like an invisible system update, and by the time the person notices, they're already living in a more contained, more observant, quieter way. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there's a hidden truth here that's rarely said out loud. This kind of isolation isn't social avoidance. It's cognitive self-protection. It's the mind trying to avoid repeating an experience that left marks, but in doing so, it starts to confuse care with permanent distance. Each decision becomes guided more by what could go wrong than by what could go right. And this internal journey creates a strange feeling. On the outside, everything looks calm. On the inside, the mind never really shuts off. The impact doesn't show up right away. It appears behind the scenes of daily life, in small choices, in the way a person anticipates disappointment before it even exists. The transformation isn't visible, but it changes how someone relates to the world. And maybe you're recognizing this right now, quietly, as you listen. If that's the case, comment below. This makes sense to me. Over time, this pulling away starts to reveal a paradox that almost no one notices at first. Fewer people around brings silence, predictability, and a real sense of control. The mind finally gets a break from reading signals, exposing itself, and constantly calculating emotional risks. There's a strange kind of peace in that. Everything feels more organized, more contained, more secure, and for a while, it seems like the decision worked better than expected. But this is exactly where the ambiguity begins to grow, Because along with that control comes a different kind of loneliness, less obvious, quieter. It's not the loneliness of being physically alone, it's the loneliness of no longer allowing yourself to be reached. Something invisible starts to go missing, the chance to be positively surprised, the possibility of unexpected encounters, conversations that could change your day, people who might break old patterns. It doesn't hurt right away, it's a loss that happens behind the scenes. Now I want to go even deeper into this because this is one of the hidden truths of this journey. Pulling away doesn't resolve the pain, it simply keeps it under control. The mind learns to avoid impact, but it also starts to avoid revelation. Each decision becomes safer but narrower. The transformation looks rational, mature, even admirable, but it comes with a quiet cost. Life starts to become too predictable, and predictability isn't the same as peace. The impact shows up when the person realizes they don't suffer like before, but they also don't feel moved like before. The protection works, but it isn't neutral. It shapes the mindset, limits choices, and redefines what's allowed to be felt. And it's at this point in the journey that a hard-to-name discomfort appears, the sense that something was preserved, but something important was also left behind. If this part speaks to you, comment below. I'm on this journey too. After all of this, an image starts to form. That often misleads people on the outside. Those who pulled away usually seem strong, independent, grounded. They give the impression of someone who has their emotional life figured out and doesn't need anyone else to feel whole. But this surface-level reading hides a much more complex dynamic happening behind the scenes. What looks like strength is often just control operating at all times, and control requires vigilance. These people aren't consciously waiting to be hurt again. What they're waiting for without realizing it is confirmation. Confirmation that the world is still unsafe. Confirmation that trusting too much is still a mistake. Confirmation that distance is the right choice. Every new relationship, every conversation that goes a little deeper, goes through silent tests. Small signals are analyzed, phrases are weighed, gestures are interpreted beyond what's necessary. The mind no longer enters openly, it enters prepared. Now I want to go even deeper into this because this is where an important shift in perspective happens. The real issue isn't distance itself, it's the permanent negative expectation that settles in. Even when someone approaches with good intentions, there's an invisible anticipation of disappointment. Not because the person wants to think that way, but because this mindset was shaped by past experiences that had real impact. The emotional journey continues, but under a defensive logic. This internal transformation creates a curious state. On the outside, everything looks stable. On the inside, nothing is fully relaxed. The person doesn't fully step into the moment, they observe the moment. And that shapes decisions, limits self-disclosure, and changes how connection is experienced. It's not a lack of feeling, it's an excess of caution. If this describes something you recognize in yourself, comment below. This makes sense to me. There's an invisible mistake that keeps this cycle going, even when the person believes they've already matured emotionally. At some point along the journey, pulling away starts to be interpreted as a sign of clarity, emotional intelligence, personal growth. And that seems logical. After all, avoiding pain is a reasonable decision. The problem begins when that decision stops being revisited, when it turns into a fixed rule instead of a conscious choice. The person starts using the same lens for everyone, not because they believe everyone is the same, but because the past taught them that trust can be costly, and almost no one notices that at this point, maturity turns into rigidity. What was meant to protect begins to restrict. Decisions stop being based on the present and become automatic responses to old experiences. The hidden truth is that not every form of pulling away is a sign of growth. Sometimes it's just fear refined into something that looks wise. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because this is where a delicate point lives. It's not about opening yourself up to everyone, and it's not about ignoring boundaries. It's about learning to differentiate, about honestly reviewing who truly deserves distance and who's paying for mistakes they never made. When everyone becomes a potential risk, the mind stops evaluating people and starts reacting to memories. And this happens quietly behind the scenes of awareness. This is the most subtle impact of this pattern. Life continues protected, but also stripped of new possibilities. The journey goes on, but with less room for positive revelations. And the question that begins to surface is no longer, why did I pull away? But something much harder to answer. How do you relearn how to trust without getting hurt again? If that question echoes inside you, comment below. This makes sense to me. If you made it this far, it's because this conversation touched something real inside you. And when that happens, it's not just about watching a video. It's about continuing to understand your own journey with more clarity and less guilt. If this kind of reflection helps you organize your thoughts, recognize patterns, and make more conscious decisions, subscribing to the channel is simply a calm way to keep going deeper, at your own pace, without pressure. If at any point you thought, this was exactly for me, leave that in the comments. Write something like, this message was for me, or I'm with you until the end. Beyond marking that you stayed until here, it helps other people realize they're not alone in this process. And if this conversation made sense to you, leaving a like is a simple gesture that keeps this kind of content alive, circulating, reaching those who also need to hear this right now. There's a video right here that complements this topic and goes even deeper into trust, boundaries, and new beginnings. Click it and keep going with me there.